Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. Chapter 5. Hermione sped towards Inchgarvy's black, igneous shoreline, beaching herself with a clatter of stone. Draco whirled off her and fell into the surf with a splash. He dragged himself out of the frigid water hand over hand, pale and already shivering. Hermione rolled onto her back and shed her ill-fitting skin with a groan. She then realized how much the poor fit had hurt her arms and legs, how much Draco's extra weight would drain her. Breathless, they crawled up the island's easternmost point, pushing past spiderwebs and creeping weeds to take refuge in the nearest fortification. Draco collapsed as soon as they were out of sight. He dropped both legs and rolled into his back, completely soaked. Hermione joined him on the stone floor, limbs heavy with exhaustion.
"Hey, Selkie,"
Draco said on a gasp.
"I'll be damned."
"You would have been damned," she corrected, "a few times over, saved by a mudblood and a half-breed." She looked over at him and finished with a pointed, "You're welcome." He frowned, an arm resting across his forehead.
"Lecture me later. I need to sleep."
"No, you don't. The water was freezing, your lips are blue, and you're still bleeding everywhere. If you sleep now, you might not wake up again."
"Would that be so bad?"
She canted an eyebrow. "After all I just went through to save you." He released a slow breath, which she interpreted as agreement. Pulled her drawstring back over and reached inside for her wand. Feeling it against her fingers gave a rush of relief. He hadn't realized how much she missed it, how much she needed it. Hermione cast a large bluebell fire between them, its warmth immediate and welcome, and then transfigured a small pile of old twigs into a flimsy drying rack. She set it up beside him, half surprised that it remained upright. "I'm going toward the island. You need to get out of those clothes. You can wrap yourself in my cloak."
"Your skin?"
he asked, somewhere between curious and repulsed. "Or stay cold and naked for all I care," she bit out. "It's your own fault if you die of exposure. I've done my part to save you." She stormed from the fortress and picked her way across the island, casting all the property wards and identify spells she could remember. He explored the remaining fortifications and learned that they were all connected through a series of subterranean tunnels and covered paths. She knew the structures originated from before the modern era, and that they had been used and reused by Muggles over the years. She understood why. The place was practically impenetrable. Combined with her wards, she felt reasonably confident that they could survive a Death Eater attack, or at least their opening salvo. The final task was to transfigure clumsy shades from handfuls of grass, which she affixed to the fortification's carved windows. She backed away to survey her work. They were far from perfect, but they would hide their firelight from Muggles and menaces alike when it grew dark. Once Inchgarvy was as secure as she could make it, Hermione rejoined Draco. He had taken her advice. His clothes hung across the improvised drying rack, and he sat with her sealskin draped across his back and over his arms, his legs tented on either side of the bluebell bonfire. She blushed at the sight of him, at the humanizing part she'd never seen before. Strong calves that shone with dark gold hair, a thick pink scar on the inside of his left knee, the leg was the limb, delicately boned ankles and pale feet, long toes with evenly trimmed nails. Her eyes locked, but he made no comment about her assessment. She sat beside him, his nylon supply bag between them. He withdrew the whiskey bottle, uncorked it, and took a swig. It was a cheap Muggle brand that burned all the way down her throat, but it warmed her better than the fire. She passed it to Draco, who took a long pull. Next, she withdrew a tin of beans, removed the lid, and set it hovering over the fire. The first warm meal in 3 days. They ate and drank in silence, the afternoon sun shining yellow-green through the transfigured shutters. The whiskey wound through her system, and only when she was sufficiently relaxed did she feel ready for the inevitable explanation that were owed. She went first. "How's your sight?"
"Fine."
She clenched her teeth, tempted to call him out, but the tension in his jaw made her reconsider. He was clearly hurting. "Will you let me look at it?" she asked instead. "You're not a healer. I'll gladly take you to St. Mungo's." The hospital maintained that it was neutral grounds. Its entrances, however, were not, and order always had lookouts stationed. He breathed an impatient laugh. "I'll take my chances with infection. Then you're an idiot. And why do you bloody care?" He glared at her with bloodshot eyes, his hair hanging limp and greasy to his chin. "You could have left me to the Death Eaters on the pier. You could have left me here to die alone. Hell, you still can, but you're not. Why?" Hermione's chest tightened as the wet thuds of corpses hitting the ground echoed in her memory. They prioritized her and Draco's survival on the pier. It had been the correct decision, and she'd make it again. But it still hurt. "I killed 2 people today," she said quietly. Draco scoffed and lifted his hand to flick a few dismissive fingers. "The Carrows don't count." "Yes, they do," she snapped. "They were evil, twisted, and sadistic. No one will miss them or mourn them, but that doesn't change that they were alive and now they're not, and that I'm the one responsible. Maybe you've killed enough people for it not to matter, but I haven't. I don't enjoy this. I don't want it." Draco turned his eyes away. "This is war," he muttered. "You can't be so attached." "Attachment is the only reason I'm fighting at all. If I didn't have Harry or Ron, if it was just me you wanted to kill and not the people I care about, the people I love, I would have laid down my wand ages ago." "Bullshit." "Excuse me?" "Bullshit," he repeated louder. "You want to survive the same as the rest of us." "Yes, I want to survive it, but it doesn't mean I want to fight. Aren't you tired of it, Draco?" He flinched as if she'd struck him. "Don't you ever think about stopping? About running away and trying for a normal life?" "Yes," he said, voice pitched low. "But you haven't," she pressed. "Why?" He didn't answer. It didn't matter. He already knew the reason. "Because you know that you can't protect them if you're dead. It wouldn't help anything, wouldn't change anything. You'd be just another blip, a memorial or a mass grave, and whatever good you might have been able to do would be buried with you. We're fighting for the same reasons." "You don't know why I'm fighting," he hissed. "You don't know anything about me." "I know we're headed to Wiltshire." Silence snapped between them, taut as bowstring. Physical reaction was far more subtle. Tightening of his fingers around her sealskin, his knuckles going white. She felt a hard press of his fingers along her forearms. "I know that's where your parents are," he continued, more measured. "I know you think you'll be safe there and that they can help you. But I don't know why you were stationed all the way up in Everness. My guess is that either the Dark Lord needed you as leverage to control your parents, or he needed your parents as leverage to control you. Your attachment to them is what's driving this whole journey. Maybe even more than that blood purity propaganda you've been force-fed your whole life." "You think you've changed me, Granger?" His eyes flashed in the firelight, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You think that after 3 days with you, I'm ready to renounce my ancestry and join the Order?" "I think you're smarter than you let on," she said, holding his gaze. "I think that up until now you never considered a different way because no one had ever offered you one." He reached out, resting her hand on his arm. "I'm offering." The olive branch hung between them, gaining weight in the silence. Draco looked away, and Hermione knew she'd lost. "You're a fool," he said, shutting down the conversation. "A naive little girl with naive little hopes." "That might be true," she admitted, "but better a naive little girl than a dead man. You need to let me look at your side." "Shove off." Her fist shot out, knuckling him in his left side. Breath wheezed from his lungs, and his face turned green in the firelight. He rocked onto one side, eyes glazed. Hermione caught his arm before he collapsed. "Shall I ask again?" Draco's lips pressed together in a thin line. He shook his head. "Glad I could convince you." He pulled the bags close, withdrawing the gin and her field medical kit. "Let down the cloak," she said. "Let me see." The sealskin drooped and Hermione's stomach twisted. The gash was rough, its edges jagged and crusted with skin that had burned black along the edges. bile at the back of her throat, but she forced herself into calm. "I don't know if I can fix it," she said, reaching for objectivity through process. "But I can at least disinfect it. A sense of dittany might help close it. Lie back." "Hold on." Draco picked up the whiskey bottle and took 2 large sips. He set the near-empty bottle beside him, laid back, keeping her cloak draped along the right side of his chest and over his hips. She took in Draco's lean shoulders and strong arms, and indulged a second of insanity as she imagined them wrapped around her, tender and gilding, exploring her most sensitive parts. It wasn't him, necessarily. More the idea of intimacy, and nostalgia for the feeling of being known and cherished, if only for a night. The moment was fleeting, however. Reality took hold once more at the side of his chest. Scars the width of her index finger crossed his abdomen and pectorals like a lattice. The edges were clean, and if it hadn't been for the distinctive pearly sheen of scar tissue, Hermione might have thought them birthmarks. But she knew too well how he'd gotten them. "Impressive, aren't they?" Draco didn't look at her, keeping his eyes safely trained on the low stone ceiling, but his bitterness was palpable, stinging the back of her throat like old smoke. "Potter's a shite spellcaster normally, but he really put effort behind this one." Hermione stopped staring and busied herself with uncorking the gin bottle. The air filled with the smell of cheap pine. "It wasn't his spell." "I know, it was Snape's," Draco said. "Doesn't mean it was easy to cast. Intention matters, and Potter—" Trailed off for a moment. "Potter meant it." He pressured a gauze square against the mouth of the bottle, then dabbed at his wound. Draco flinched but didn't cry out. "I didn't realize the extent of it," Hermione said. "I didn't exactly advertise it. You might not remember, but I had a good reason to keep myself covered during our 6th year." From her peripheral vision, Hermione saw the dark mark move over the skin of his left forearm. The snake twisted slowly through the skull, its empty eyes staring into oblivion. Hermione would never admit it, but the dark mark scared her. She cleared her throat, trying for nonchalance. "Harry suspected you. I thought he was being absurd. I thought there was no way." She shook her head. "Not a 16-year-old. When has age mattered to the Dark Lord?" Draco asked, stirring a bit. The whiskey was catching up to him. "He tried to murder a baby." Hermione breathed a dark laugh. "That he did." Once the wound was somewhat cleaner, Hermione used her wand to trim away the dead and burnt skin. Draco held perfectly still, as if he felt nothing. And perhaps he didn't. The nerve endings at the wound site had probably been destroyed. Let her eyes drift down his body, over his hips and the secret structures hidden by the folds of her cloak, stopping at the thick raised scar that formed a shallow crescent in the interior of his knee. "What happened to your knee?" "Severing hex during the skirmish of Smallwolf." Hermione paused in her trimming. After the stalemate of Hogwarts in 1998, the inaccurately named skirmish at Smallwolf was the largest battle between the Order and the Death Eaters. It had taken place in a coastal village in northern Scotland, where there were rumors of an ancient tunnel leading directly into Hogwarts. The Death Eaters were convinced it existed. They had been scouting the area for months, trying to find the likeliest entrance. The Order had gotten wind of their interest and staged an attack. Since 3 years of dummy raids and botched assassination attempts had failed to give either side an advantage, Kingsley's intention had been to end it all, right there. Instead, an errant fiendfire had burnt the entire village to the ground. Predictably, the Death Eaters had fled at the first opportunity, but the surviving Order's members had remained to fight the flames. Cursed fire had burned itself out after 17 hours of raging, when the wind had shifted and the leaping flames had run out of man-made structures to consume. Most combatants still bore the burn scars. Smallwolf itself remained abandoned to this day. Many claimed it was haunted. No one questioned the possibility. "You were there." His eyes flicked to hers. "You weren't." Hermione shook her head. I was making a run down the coast when intelligence came through. They couldn't wait for me.
How did you survive it? Mother shoved a portkey into my hand the second I went down before the Fanfire was cast. She was so quick. I'm half convinced she planned it with my father. The family elves did their best with it.
He sighed and tended the knee slightly, testing its bend.
Never was the same, though.
His eyes grew unfocused as the whiskey continued to work its magic. Despite her own pulse from the bottle, Hermione felt stone sober. This was the most Draco had shared with her since they'd started this misadventure, and he didn't seem opposed to continuing the conversation. Perhaps there was still hope. A rare second chance to break through to him.
Where are your scars, Granger?
Thoughts of strategic manipulation receded at the question. Draco looked at her openly, expectantly, and Hermione thought of what Madungus Fletcher, of all people, had taught her. It's rare to get without giving. She set her wand down, turned her back to him, and lifted her shirt. A series of 5 evenly spaced scars, about a palm's length long and 2 fingers wide, their thickest, raced down her back. The marks began between her shoulder blades and ended just above her buttock. "Boat propeller," she said ruefully. "I was drifting in what I thought was a no-engine harbor, half asleep. I didn't even hear it coming." She gasped at the cold of his fingers. It was the alcohol, she knew. He'd never have touched her otherwise, inasmuch as his per usual warmed her. The knowledge of this wreckage his hands had caused over their shared time on this planet kept her still. He endured his touch and the weight of his eyes until his hand fell away.
How do you survive it?
Sealskins are resilient. She lowered her shirt and turned to face him, uncapping the essence of dittany. I stayed in the harbor for a few days as it scabbed over. Once I was sure my blood wouldn't attract sharks or whales, I got moving again. By the time I reached the order, they'd pretty much healed. Nothing they could do about the scars. Deep breath now. This is going to sting. He applied a drop of the potion to Draco's wound. Slow exhale accompanied the hissing appearance of new skin.
"You've always been a Selkie?"
He asked, the question high-pitched with pain. Hermione debated her answer. This part of her history wasn't something she shared easily, less so with someone who would revile her for it. But the skin around his eyes was tight, and sweat had beaded up on his forehead, dripping down into a tangle of his shaggy hair. He already disgusted him. What difference would this make? "I found out when I was 7, she said, dipping her head to check how much skin had regrown. Not enough. Mum sent me to my grandmother on the Isle of Skye one summer. They didn't get on, so it was just me. I don't know if my parents just wanted a summer of their own, or if they knew something about me was different. This happened before any of us had the slightest clue I was a witch." Another hiss, accompanied by the blood-iron smell of new skin. "My grandmother lived in a little cottage on the water, right outside Ig in the north. The first night we were there, she had Grandad drop us in Portree. He gave her a blanket as she got out of the auto, so I thought we were going for a late picnic to watch the sunset. We walked out onto the quay, and she shoved me in. I'd never been swimming before." Draco flinched, either at the application of a third drop or the twist in her story. He wasn't sure which. "I thought I was drowning," Hermione continued, "until I suddenly wasn't. I felt myself change, and then I saw my grandmother. The blanket she'd been carrying was her sealskin. We swam back to Ig together, and she explained our history in the way. She'd been born a Selkie, as had her mother before her, extending back as far as Nan could remember. Part of the falling out between her and Mum was that Mum wanted nothing to do with it, chose to leave Skye to pursue dentistry in London. Nan hoped I'd be different. We spent the rest of the summer in the ocean, swimming and catching fish. She said it was the most fun she'd been allowed in years." "Allowed?" Draco's eyes flicked to hers. "Nan and Grandad had a fairy-tale romance," Hermione said, tone as brittle as a sword rhyme. "She adventured on a shore as a young woman, and Grandad stole her sealskin." She let the 4th drop fall. Draco shuddered and looked back at the ceiling.
"Why didn't she leave?"
"She tried. Grandad kept her skin hidden throughout my mother's childhood. The first time he'd allowed her to have it back was that summer with me. Figured correctly that she wouldn't leave me alone.
Did you ever ask her about it?
Hermione shifted. Yes. Draco prompted her through the expectant silence.
And?
She was in her 70s by then, Hermione said, applying what she hoped would be the final drop. Made a show of ducking her head, using the guise of checking the wound to hide her own pain at the memory. It had been the summer before Hermione turned 10. She'd been pestering Nan for the story of her and Granddad's romance since she'd arrived, convinced it would be a tale of secret yearning and boundary-defying affection. Nan had dodged the question, but broke down on their final night together. Her story ran entirely counter to the tale of true love Hermione had built in her mind. Her grandfather had forced her grandmother into a landlocked life. He trapped her in a house she'd never liked with children she'd never wanted, all because he hadn't trusted her to choose him over her freedom. Horrified, Hermione had asked the same question as Draco, and Nan had simply smiled, eyes sad and distant as she gave a reply that Hermione had never forgotten.
Much is weathered by time and tide.
Hermione had lit like a fuse at the defeat in her Nan's tone, and they'd fought. All three of them, because there was certainly no sparing her grandfather's role in the matter. When her mother came to pick her up the next day, Hermione hadn't offered either of them a single word of gratitude or forgiveness. What Hermione hadn't known, couldn't have known, was that the summer of 1989 was the last summer she and Nan would share. Nan had died just 1 month later of a heart attack. Her grandfather had followed not long after, grief-struck and alone. Hermione hadn't apologized to either of them. She swiped at her eyes with the back of her hand and cleared her throat.
"That should hold for tonight,"
she said, probing gently at the shiny pink layer of skin that now sealed Draco's wound. It seemed to hold.
"I don't think I need to bandage it, but I can if you'd like."
He shook his head.
"I'm fine. Ranger?"
She stopped repacking the field kit to look at him.
"Thanks."
She kept her expression neutral and tried for a shrug.
"I would say you'd do the same for me, but I wouldn't."
Their mission was stark, filled with something that sounded close to grief.
"I would have left you to die."
He looked back towards the ceiling, eyes shining, growing distant.
"I wasn't always like this, you know. I was a sweet child, spoiled, but sweet. All I ever wanted was to do something great and make my family proud. Live up to the history of my surname."
She bit her tongue to keep from arguing or pressing the point. Ethanol-inspired wisdom was as changeable as the open sea. He'd have to navigate his waters alone. She had other currents to swim tonight. Hermione stood and stretched. "It's getting dark," she said. "I'm going to dim the fire. You should try to get some rest." She handed over her Mac. "Trade you for the sealskin?" Draco's brows furrowed and he propped himself up onto his elbow.
"You're not leaving?"
"I am, and you're in no position to stop me." He struggled to sit up, wincing as the new skin bunched along his side. He fumbled for his wand. Hermione let him palm it and aim. Draco had repeatedly demonstrated his reluctance to do magic the past few days. She didn't understand why quite yet, but she felt confident that he wouldn't break that self-imposed rule right now, when their situation was so tenuous. "The Order has a safe house in Edinburgh." Let the statement hang, allowing it the proper space to inflate. Both sides closely guarded the locations of their safe houses. Knowledge of a safe house city was reason enough to relocate it, and circumstances aside, there was nothing stopping Draco from shouting it from the rooftops for his fellow Death Eaters. But if the Carrolls had been telling the truth, there might not be a need for that now. His wand lowered a fraction.
"You might not like what you find."
"It's better than not knowing."
"And if they are?"
Didn't finish the question, and he didn't have to. Hermione knew what he meant. Then nothing has changed.
"And if they aren't?"
"Then everything has." On impulse, she reached behind her neck and unclasped a necklace. A thin gold chain hung with a phoenix bundle. The bird's wings were extended, and its eyes shone with a ruby chip. Hermione had received it from her parents on her 17th birthday. It was all he had left of them. meant more to her than Draco could ever know. She held it out for him. "Collateral," she said, voice on the edge of breaking. She forced her fingers to loosen, and the necklace slid into Draco's open palm. "I'll be back for that." "Alone?" "I don't know. That's your choice to make. If you're here when I return, then I can guarantee your safety with the order." His eyes narrowed. "I'll be a prisoner." "Yes, but you won't be killed. The order will try to use you, turn you, and I'll help them however I can. If you're not here when I return—" He shrugged, struggling to find the words. "If you're not here, then I wish you luck. Truly." He considered the pile of gold in his palm, then closed his fingers around it. "Fine." He set down his wand and offered up a corner of the sealskin. Hermione took it, averting her eyes as it slid from his hip. She walked to the fortress door and stood at its threshold, where the sea smell was strongest, where the air was cool and the firelight fair to cast away the grey evening shadows. She stripped her socks first, followed by her trousers, shirt, and undergarments, all the while keenly aware of Draco's eyes. She could feel the heat of his gaze on her skin and had a small intake of breath as she shimmied her knickers down her leg. She couldn't bear the thought of looking at him then. His disgust or his interest would have been equally as damaging. She tossed the knife from her waistband towards the fire. "What's that?" he asked. "An insurance policy," she answered. "I didn't need to use it." She drew her sealskin over her shoulders and yearned for the sea. The transformation took hold, seamlessly sending her to the ground. She picked up her wand, holding it delicately between her teeth as she bounced herself down the cooling scrub grass. She slid silently from the rocky shore into the cold, freeing water of the North Sea, barely a ripple in her wake. To be continued. Thank you for listening to Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.